nephrologist, so I take care of patients with adult kidney disease and focus on chronic kidney disease and dialysis. I'm an investigator at the Population Health Research Institute in Hamilton and the Canadian Vigor Center here in Edmonton. And my research focuses on clinical trials, including EDI in the clinical trial space, and also the intersection between gender diverse patients with kidney health and disease. The Women's and Children's Health Research Institute, or WCHRI, it's a partnership between the University of Alberta, Alberta Health Services, the Stollery's Children's Hospital Foundation, and the Alberta Women's Health Foundation. So welcome everyone to this webinar series, Happy Pride, EDI in Action, Advancing Research with Women Plus and Children is the name of the webinar, and it's jointly hosted by WCHRI and the College of Health Sciences. I would like to thank the Stollery Children's Hospital Foundation and the Alberta Women's Health Foundation for making this webinar series possible. I'd like to start by respectively acknowledging that the University of Alberta is located on Treaty 6 territory. This is a traditional gathering place for a diverse group of Indigenous peoples, including Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, and Anishinaabe, Inuit, as well as many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. We honor the profound wisdom, knowledge, and experience of Indigenous peoples who have been stewards of this land since time immemorial and whose teachings continue to illuminate the path forward for our sacred responsibilities as researchers now and for generations to come. So today we're all here together at a significant time where there's societal debate about the role and value of diversity initiatives. It's really a charged political climate, especially south of the border, but it's relevant to where we are in Alberta and across Canada. And we recognize that meaningful research progress really depends on diverse perspectives and experiences. And as a research community, we need to actively work to address longstanding inequities in who conducts research, whose questions are studies and how they're focused, and who benefits from this scientific advancement. Through these sessions, we aim to provide practical strategies and thoughtful discussions that help us collectively build a more inclusive research ecosystem, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because diverse and equitable research environments produce better science and really benefits everyone at the table, including patients and patient partners. Thank you to everyone participating in today's important conversation. I'm going to be the moderator of today's session called Gender Inclusive Research Practice. Everything will be recorded. Our speakers will answer your questions after their presentation is over. We're trying to reserve around 15 minutes for a really fruitful discussion here today. You can type your questions in the chat or ask them directly with the raise a hand function at the end of the question and answer period. So thank you for the opportunity to moderate and to say some introductions. I'll hand it over to the speakers now who are going to introduce themselves. Thanks.
So good afternoon, everyone. We're here to talk about gender inclusive research in the context of the Beyond the Binary Canada guide. That is a resource that promotes gender inclusive and community engaged approaches to health research for those who experience gender-related health inequities. So we're really delighted with the invitation to be here today to share some highlights from the guide and to discuss how it can support researchers in making progress towards, as David said, more inclusive and thus more rigorous and equitable health research. So this is about increasing the relevance of the research that we do. Next slide, please. My name is Tamil Kendall, and I'm the director of the Partnership for Women's Health Research Canada, or POWER, which is a national alliance of Canada's foremost women's health research institutes, including the Women's Health Research Institute, or WHRI, in British Columbia, WCHRI in Alberta, the Women's College Research and Innovation Institute at Women's College Hospital in Toronto, Ontario, and IWK Health, which is located in Halifax, Nova Scotia, but has a mandate to do research and provide healthcare for women, children, and families across the Maritimes. I myself am a women's health researcher by training and practice, and I was involved in this process as the chair of the Beyond the Binary Canada process. And then I'm joined in this by my colleagues, BC and Nicole. So BC Pomeroy is a senior director at the Provincial Health Services Authority in British Columbia, but also a longtime community-based researcher who is themselves queer and who has been really our community lead and co-chair throughout this process from the very beginning. And Nicole Presley, who is the manager for knowledge translation and research at the Women's Health Research Institute in BC and has been involved in both the project management and the knowledge translation coming out of this guide from the very beginning. So I'm very grateful to be with them to share this process and information with you. Next slide, please. As we begin today, I want to acknowledge that my home is located in what is colonially known as Victoria, BC, which is the unceded ancestral territory of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, and also that the WHRI and Power offices are on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. And I think it's really important for us in doing this work of Beyond the Binary, but in all the research work that we do to cultivate cultural humility in ourselves and really productive and collaborative relationships with First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and other Indigenous communities and peoples. And for me, I think about the importance of every so often rereading the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action and reflecting on how I am or how I am not moving those forward in the work and in the actions that I'm taking. So to start off with the content, it's important to think about what we mean by sex and what we mean by gender. Next slide, please, Nicole. So sex are biological and physiological differences between sexes. So this is chromosomes, hormones, and this is frequently assigned at birth based on what a person's genitals look like at that time. Gender, on the other hand, is a psychosocial and a cultural construct that really varies across time and space. Some of my training is in anthropology, and that's a useful place to look if you want to understand how much gender changes in different times and places. And it's not only something that we about our own gender identity, how we understand ourselves from growing up in a particular society within a particular culture, but also something that is a very important stratifier in societies. So it sets out expectations for people, and it also is very important for distributing power and privilege within societies. So next slide, please. Important also to recognize that neither sex nor gender are binary, even though they are frequently referred to in a binary way in our society, in our dominant Western society, as well as in the health research that we do. We have had over the past 40 years some sex disaggregated research that has taught us things such as the fact that females' bodies metabolize drugs in different ways. And so we know that drugs are much more likely to be withdrawn from market because of adverse effects in females, or that females are often diagnosed later than males with the same condition because some of the manifestations, some of the symptoms of those diseases or disease conditions may be different. But for a long time, we're still trying to make up the fact that females were excluded from clinical trials for almost 20 years and still are not appropriately represented for many reasons, consistent with the burden of disease among females. And I will just make a note, and of course, pregnant and lactating females, women, and other pregnant people continue to be almost completely excluded. Like sex, gender is not consistently included in health research. So it's not included, it's not measured, it's not reported out on. And some Canadian research in the area of heart health actually showed us how important this measurement of gender can be. So they found that feminine traits, independent of female sex, was associated with recurrent acute coronary syndromes in a population of young adults. And as I noted at the top, even when gender is included, it's frequently treated in a binary way, men, women, with the assumption that these are cis men and cis women. And it really ignores the whole range of experience of gender diverse people. Next slide, please. So there's a tension here. So the focus on women may exclude trans women, non-binary, and gender diverse people. But we also need more research on women, and that is tailored to the needs of women at the same time. So we've made progress, some progress on women's health research, but we want more inclusive women's health research. Next slide, please. One popular approach has been to be gender neutral, and we saw this really gaining momentum during the COVID pandemic, where we heard discussions about pregnant and lactating individuals where the cis women gender identity was not mentioned, or where people are being described by their anatomy. So in the field of what previously was known as women's cancers, we're referring only to individuals with a cervix. And so this is one way to approach this that we discuss in the guide, but at the same time, this call, as the call and movement towards more gender inclusive language grows, others have noted that there are consequences to adapting this neutral language, that it may be dehumanizing for people to be referred to by their anatomy, or that referring only to individuals may invisibilize important social histories and identities. So one example of that is that we know that Black women and immigrant women face worse health outcomes because there's an intersection between these social constructs of race, racialization, and their identity as women. And so as we continue to combat health inequities experienced by these and other groups, their identities and histories really need to be at the center. Consequently, next slide, please, Nicole. We in the Beyond the Binary, if you click it again, have taken the approach of moving towards what we call gender additive language. So we would talk about Black women and gender diverse persons, or pregnant women and birthing individuals. And this is part of an approach that in which we use clear, consistent, and precise language when we are describing research participants. And that we believe that our research thus needs to include questions that probe both sex and gender identity. And furthermore, that when it's aligned with the main research question, that every study should try to be inclusive of cis women in women's health, but also trans and non-cis women and others, because this is the only way that we really begin to build our knowledge about the potentially unique or very similar experiences and health needs of different gender groups. Next slide, please. So change is challenging, and David referred to how very relevant this is, particularly at this point in time when we are seeing significant reactionary forces, and in fact, a very unscientific approach to looking at both sex and gender. So the White House, I will just say, has adopted a position that there are only two genders and that those genders are male and female. And you will appreciate from the remarks that I made previously that that does not align with our scientific understanding of what sex is, what gender is, and particularly around gender, what a diversity of gender identities are. So these challenges should not prohibit change, because if we fail to change and to move forward, we will continue to marginalize gender diverse persons and potentially cis women as well. So we need more health research with trans and non-binary folks and other gender diverse individuals. And we also need more research both about cis women and about females. So today we're going to share some information with you from the Beyond the Binary guide, which I noted is a guidance package to support implementation of gender inclusive and community engaged research. Next slide, please. And this is really, as we referred to a bit in our introductions, a multi-year, multiple collaborative kind of approach that has engaged with many researchers, research administrators, but also very importantly with community members who experience or have experienced gender-based inequities. It hasn't been a straight line, as is shown on the next slide. So it began in BC with the identification from researchers of questions about how do I do better and more gender inclusive research, into conversations with community and researchers that resulted in the first Beyond the Binary guide, which was a BC product. In 2023, we were lucky to be supported by an Institute of Gender and Health CIHR Planning and Dissemination grant that allowed Power and WHRI to come together and bring that to a national scale, to relook at content as well as structure, and to translate the guide into French. So it's now available in both French and English. And we are doing presentations like this to disseminate and make this knowledge available. The guide is also up on the Power website in both languages, but we're also embarking on a new and very exciting project that will create knowledge translation tools for research reviewers and research ethics boards so that they can guide and support researchers to do relevant gender inclusive research. So if you're interested in that, get in touch with me or with Bethan Kingsley, because that new phase of this Beyond the Binary work will be based at WCHRI, which we're very pleased about. So now I'm going to pass it over to BC to talk more about our approach in the work, and then to Nicole to talk more about the content. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks, Tamil. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about our approach on this project. I was brought in right at the beginning. I think actually even the harried, as we all know, grant application process way back when, I think getting an email from Nicole at midnight or something. Yeah, so our approach. So when we consider engagement in this project, our team prioritized a patient-oriented research approach. This work really had to be done in partnership and co-produced with the individuals and communities impacted in the organizations who are providing services and programs to our population. And through the process, we very quickly realized we needed to add justice-oriented to our approach as a way to name and account for systemic discrimination related to gender in the Beyond the Binary project itself. So our goal collectively was to mitigate, to the best of our ability, harm or even reharming of community when we partner on research teams, not as participants, but partners in research. Next slide, please. I'm sure many of you are likely familiar with the concept of patient-oriented research, or POR, which was formerly catalyzed by the Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research here in Canada. So really a simplified way of describing POR is this idea of nothing about us without us, that recognizes that patients and people with lived and living experiences should be engaged as partners to identify and co-create the research that we were about to undertake. So upon engaging our community members, again, we quickly realized that this trauma-informed approach and these different layers in patient-oriented research needed to be a priority for us. And these concepts really helped us consider patients and those with lived and living experience in our approach, how best to invite into these conversations, where they're being invited, is this a safer space, and some of these concepts that we recognized. Next slide, please. And so one of the concepts in here was trauma resiliency informed. This is a project that came out of Fraser Health, one of the health authorities in BC in mental health and substance use, and just really acknowledging how people live with trauma and how practices, in particular in research and in care, can activate trauma, can be traumatizing, and there could be these responses for folks with lived and living experiences, and in researchers ourselves. Many of us that are researching in this space are a part of these communities, and so we really chose to take that approach within our project. And so I think there's a link in some of the resources you can look at this. There are, a couple principles, 6 principles around trauma resiliency informed process. And again, this sort of was interesting for us because it had been used in care practices at point of care. And so we adapted that specifically in research when we're thinking of patient-oriented research to really mitigate, again, sort of traumatizing or re-traumatizing folks in our projects. And it's just inherently anti-oppressive and just really promotes this idea that Tamil sort of talked about, these critical reflections on how we can account for how our systems we work within and represent really shape people's engagement with us. Next slide. And again, I think a lot of you are probably familiar with this wheel and taking an intersectional approach to research and how that really helped us inform our choices in language use by better considering these intersecting identities of the communities that we want to engage with. Gender, as we know, is not experienced within a vacuum, and intersectionality or considering intersectional intersecting identities acknowledges how multiple factors can coexist and compound oppression in the work that we're doing when we're sharing and co-creating research for folks in our communities. So Women's Health Research in Canada has undoubtedly raised awareness of the implications of sex and gender on well-being and has informed health research policy and practice. Yet, tendencies to lump all women's experiences together, disregarding intersecting social positions, really undermines the integrity, rigor, and applicability of science. And I have to say, when I first started this project, I came in like non-binary, queer, everything's neutral. I really did come in with a bias of neutralizing gender, and very quickly learned from Nicole and Lori and Tamil and the team, let's look at this as a women's additive sort of methodology, and really sort of shifting our focus and how we're doing this project. Next slide. Most of you are probably familiar with Audre Lorde, talking about there's no such thing as a single issue struggle. We don't live in single issue lives. And so really, again, leaning into this intersectionality and intersecting identities and intersecting experiences within the folks that we were partnering with. Next slide. And so the project started with 3 groups. We had members of the research community. We had members of community who represent people with lived and living experiences of gender-based inequities. And then the core team, which was myself, Tamil, Nicole, Kira, a few other folks that were on that team. And we kind of did it this way, again, to create a bit of a safer space for folks, especially community members that were coming in, but also for the core team. We were all learning how to do this engagement in better and well ways, and sort of set it up this way initially to be able to do that. And this model was community informed, again, to allow for safe dialogue that recognized health researchers are part of systems that have harmed and continue to harm harm community members. So with this model, the core team, we were able to liaison between the two groups to share and reconcile feedback over each project. But while the groups initiated separately, over time, as we were learning about this project and creating more comfort and trust, at the request of both the research community and people with lived and living experience, they really wanted to have opportunities to connect as the work evolved. And so that's exactly what we did. Next slide. And so these are just some of the ways these principles were applied throughout our particular project. So you'll see here connection, forming relationships. Again, we did that with a lot of intention and a lot of mindfulness. The co-creation, we established community terms of reference. Now we're sort of leaning towards guidelines and intentions. See compassion and care. We always ensured that we sort of foregrounded those pieces around mindful self-compassion. What are we doing to keep ourselves well in this work? Taking extra time, adapting. This was actually the interesting thing. You get these grants. They're 12 months. How do you do this type of work and engage with communities who have historically been oppressed and have been experiencing such bias and stigma, and you're trying to do this in 12 months? So we did actually go to our funder, Michael Smith Foundation, and say, listen, this is a convening grant. We understand you gave us 12 months, but guess what? We need more time. So again, we tried to advocate for further time so that we were being really mindful and intention as we're moving, as we were going forward. This idea of consent and ongoing, when we think of communities, and particularly right now, Tamil touched on it, our current political climate, there are times both when someone's personal life within this community that they may transition or shift their identity and their expression of their gender. And so we really wanted to make sure that consent was ongoing and checking in with folks and building in those opportunities where they could change their consent or how it looked like and how they showed up. When you think how we're naming folks, a lot of folks in the end just went to initials or didn't want their name put out there because they were receiving a lot of hate and backlash online and in some of these social spheres. So these are just some sort of notes, some things we just wanted you to consider. And that idea of removing of consent, we think often as getting consent and what does that look like, but we often don't think of what is removing consent or adapting and shifting consent in our project. We haven't really considered that very well in our patient-oriented research. And next slide. So what we heard, this tension around acknowledging this term around women, I expressed sort of my own experience in there. That tension definitely exists in our work. The normalizing use of cisgender by the research community itself. So this is how we're sort of trying to build this knowledge barrier. So addressing barriers to using additive language approaches. And I know Nicole's going to talk about a few things in that area. And then just continuous. This is iterative. It's reflective, even within ourselves as a research team, as we grow our knowledge and we learn more and bring more and more folks from community into these projects to help co-create and prioritize research. We have to have our own reflexivity as a continuous practice in this work. And again, highlighting intersecting identities and that it is sort of an ongoing iterative journey as we're doing this work as researchers and patient-oriented research. And I believe I'm handing it over to the amazing Nicole.
Thanks, BC. Yeah, and just thanks to BC, like we learned so much from even the two different projects. I think in the self-care space, we started out with, documents and resources to support the community task force and the community steering committee. But between the two projects, I think you were responsible for kind of the support of a mentorship and peer support model, so that if folks were feeling triggered after community task force meetings, that there was a mechanism and a compensation model that were built into the project to really support that. So that kind of ongoing learning that we've been very lucky to apply, and also our funding bodies did increase the amount of the competition funds and extend the amount of time that we had to complete the work. So advocacy worked in our case. So my role today is to just give you a tour of the guide itself, and really my hope is to show how we've applied some of what Tamil's talked about and some of what BC has talked about into the content itself. And so the sections here that I'm going to focus on, the first is Language Matters, which contains kind of the rationale for our work, why language matters in a health research context, and why an intersectional approach to this work is so critical. I'll go through the example scenarios and take you through a specific example scenario. These were co-created with our research community, with our community task forces. They use glossary terms and are nested within research processes that we're all kind of familiar with. So that real world setting for the research community. Principles and practices is really about what BC just mentioned, that continuity of the work. This isn't checklist work, this is commitment work. And so how do we foster that on an ongoing basis? The glossary, I won't do a deep dive in, but I did want to really just call it out here because it is quite unique. There's lots of glossaries out there. I think what's unique about this one is that the terms and the links to the sources of the terms, so the where you would find the source information, our community members kind of said to us, you know what, you constantly kind of cite sources that are known for systemic oppression, harm to our communities. We need to start recognizing the community members, the organizations, and the people who are really at the forefront of the terminology that's being created via their advocacy, their justice efforts. So I think that's a unique aspect of our glossary that differentiates it from others. And also just for those who maybe want to share the guide with leaders, we also do have an executive summary section that's kind of, we call it the if you have 5 minutes, which is a nice entryway. So our Language Matters section, so how did we address these kind of considerations around barriers to gender additive language, the tension of women's health and concerns of erasure, as well as kind of normalizing the use of cisgender. So you'll see a screenshot on the side of the page here. This is the start of our Language Matters section. And so we really did prioritize articulating that taking an intersectional approach to language use is necessary. We have different strategies, we can use different strategies, and we should think about why and when they might be appropriate. We also wanted to set the tone that language is changing over time, and that while some of the terms and approaches that we know now may change, and so we can't attach ourselves to that checklist type model. We have to continue that curiosity. And even within the scope of that squiggly timeline that we've been involved in this project, our language and terminology has changed over time. And I know we've been grateful to be a part of conversations with community members who have told us we also don't all agree on terminology. So please don't think that there's a consistent thing that we're all saying yes to. So just setting that energy that we need to tuck into, that we might make mistakes. Our Language Matters section, so we kind of provide an overview of those 3 approaches to language and discuss the strengths and limitations to each of them. So Tamil did a really great job at talking about kind of the gender neutral, the anatomy based, and the gender additive approaches. And so, gender additive is that women and what we have heard is that this can be misused. When we talk about gender additive, we do talk about listing all genders. And we've heard from some of our researchers that, oh, this can be very wordy and it can be very lengthy. And what about word count constraints? And those are real. Those are real constraints that you may have. We do think that by using this in the right way, by saying cisgender, by using cisgender alongside all of the other genders, that can create a very inclusive research environment. One of the things that we have heard as well is that using the term cis, it is being more and more recognized as a plain language term, but not all communities recognize it as a plain language term, so it can sometimes be seen as a barrier. Gender neutral, so this is a more pregnant people, and Tamil mentioned some of the limitations to it. One other flag that we had from community members is just thinking about it in a non-English translation setting, that it can be difficult to translate it if you're using multiple recruitment materials. And anatomy-based, this is that people with a cervix. You know, we've discussed how this can be dehumanizing. Another concern that we've heard is just around health literacy. So if this is for a public audience, that, you know, a 2023 survey found that only 48% of respondents met health literacy criteria and levels in Canada. So we do have to think about how familiar everyone is with their own anatomy and different parts, and in particular in a women's health context where there is a lot of shame and stigma around what happens with our bodies. So in our principles and practices section, you know, further to kind of BC's point about how do we kind of foster commitment to these justice-oriented approaches and how do we do better as researchers, we include a reflexivity exercise in the principles and practices section. And so, you know, the practice of reflexivity is really about locating ourselves within those research and social and cultural contexts. And we do this to kind of understand the relationship to power, and that kind of results in understanding our positionality. And as we've said, we can't do this through a checklist. The goal of doing this with yourself and with in kind of the relationship with others, hopefully within your own research teams, is that you start to build accountability into our research processes, relationships, and through the outputs. And I think, David, you did such a great job kind of introducing this concept, which is this does help us understand what biases we're bringing into our work. This helps us think about how we prioritize certain research questions. This can help us kind of reflect on who's not at those tables, who's not on the teams that perhaps should be represented, so that we can do better science and improve patient outcomes more broadly and more inclusively. And so this exercise is from the KT Canada Intersectionality Guide and Intersectionality Reflection Workbook. Also within our principles and practices section, we really do, you know, I think continuity and reflexivity are ones we've talked about a bit. That kind of agility around language approaches is another one. And our kind of hope is that that engagement piece, you know, community engagement piece is like the core of everything. When you're connected to people with lived experience, you have that perspective accounted for in your work and hopefully driving the work that you do and the priorities that you make. So just switching over to our example scenarios section, as you can see, we have examples all the way from proposal development, inclusion criteria, REBs, advisory board formation, both quant and qual data analysis, outcomes and reporting, and knowledge mobilization. And these examples are not prescriptive. They're really just meant to illustrate what could you do in particular settings. And these take those glossary terms I mentioned, nest them in our real world research setting, and describe different approaches to a solution. And the one that I'm going to tuck into now is example 3, which is from about research ethics board submissions. So a research team was planning a clinical research study by examining the impact of a particular medication taken during pregnancy on the health outcomes of the infant and birthing parent during the postpartum period. The team submitted to their local research ethics board. Now, when reviewing the team's application, the REB members noted the use of the word women and pregnant women throughout their public-facing study documents, including their recruitment material. And you'll see a variety of recruitment graphics and posters on this slide. These are similar to the ones that the research team submitted to the REB. The reviewers noted that the recruitment materials could result in the exclusion of people with other genders who could be eligible to take part in the study but don't identify as women. The non-inclusion or exclusion of these people also results in them not being able to benefit from the findings of the research study. And now it's worth noting that within this space, the REB members might also be prompted to look through the other participant-facing materials, such as data collection forms, consent forms, and other materials. Now, in response by the reviewers, the response by the reviewers takes into account the Tri-Council Policy Statement 2, or TCPS 2, Chapter 4, Article 4.1. One of the core principles set out in the TCPS 2 is that of justice, which holds that particular individuals, groups, or communities should not bear an unfair share of the burden of participating in research and should not be unfairly excluded from the potential benefits of research participation. The justice principle maintains that researchers should not exclude individuals from the opportunity to participate in research on the basis of attributes such as culture, language, religion, race, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, linguistic proficiency, gender, or age, unless there is a valid reason for the exclusion. So the REB reviewers recommended that the team review the Beyond the Binary Guide to explore other language approaches, as well as make their inclusion and exclusion criteria more specific. They reminded the team about gender additive language approaches and flagged similar issues in their other participant-facing materials. And as Tamil mentioned, this particular example is close to home with our future work as we kind of move towards empowering the REBs with knowledge translation tools across Canada under the leadership of Dr. Sophia Ahmed and Bethan Kingsley, who's here today, and we're grateful to have you. And so as we close up, I just want to acknowledge a statement by one of our community members, Elder Sandy Leo, who shared with us, it is always best to ask people the language they use to describe their own experiences. And I think if you're going to take anything away, take that away and think about community engagement in your own research setting. And so just to close, language is impactful. It can exclude, it can include. Languages are ever changing, so we need to be agile to those changes. And as BC is always kind of reminding us to be kind to ourselves, expressing that self-compassion as we may fumble along the way as we learn new language and terminology, and that language is context specific. And so it's important to think about the audience, to understand their needs and tailor your language accordingly. So thanks so much to you all for spending your time with us this afternoon. Thank you to all of our partners and supporters who continue to champion this work and be involved and apply the work in a research setting. So we're happy to open it up to questions. And I think Tamil popped some emails in the chat. You're welcome to reach out to any of us. Thanks so much.
All right, thanks so much, Tamil, BC, and Nicole. I think this has been a wonderful discussion and insight into the work that has been necessary, that you are leading and multiple people across Canada are leading. I'll just mention that I've had the opportunity to review Beyond the Binary in advance of today, and going through the examples I thought were fantastic. As a researcher who navigates ethics, data collection, the consent form, all aspects of that research cycle. I think it's great to see real world examples that you can learn from that really sets the precedence for engaging these types of questions. So we have about 15 minutes for questions. I'll open it up to people in the chat or just raise your hand and we'll select you. So don't be shy. I think we're here to learn lots of different things. I don't see anything in the chat so far, so maybe I'll jump off with my first question. So I think like I do clinical trials that are industry and investigator initiated, and sometimes I'm the person designing and conducting them. Other times I'm along for the ride. And sometimes in the spaces where I am not necessarily the main voice as someone who has experience engaging gender diverse communities and gender diverse patient partners and really gender specific research, that a lot of people don't necessarily think that this is important. And the question that always comes to it is, well, it's not directly related to the research question, and it's not specific to this. And we have limited time, energy, resources. And I always feel like I'm trying to convince or to demonstrate value of the inclusivity about that potential bias. And I talk about intersectionality and what you bring to the space as a researcher in the team. But I always find it's a challenging discussion to have. And then people come back from an intersectionality standpoint to say that's too much data collection. We have to be simple and pragmatic. Our subgroup analysis are binary, yes, no for most things. How do you really sell the value and importance of this in someone who may not, be as familiar with this or necessarily in the audience of the type of person that's coming to this WCHRI series and is excited and engaged? I think it's a tough question to lean off, but it's something that I think about and I struggle with all the time, and I would love to hear what your approaches would be.
I'm sure that we all have something to say about this. So I will refer a bunch of things come to mind. So one is we know that gender-related barriers result in people participating less in research and also not completing research, including clinical trials, as well as those other intersectional issues like racialization, like socioeconomic status, et cetera. And so one of the arguments for the clinical trial is, right, we want to keep our participants that enroll in this trial throughout. We want it to be representative of the population, but we also, I think, gender specifically, because I bet you get more pushback around gender than about sex. We want to understand, like, if our trial is not retaining gender diverse people, or if it's not retaining cis women, then that is something that we are interested, I think, in digging into in terms of our dropout rates and doing better in subsequent trials, like understanding that. So that's one possible argument. The other part, and this, I mean, this does make it more complicated if you're interested in actually exploring gendered traits, but I found that study that was done with Louise Pilot's group out of McGill to just be really impactful. Like, this is showing us that actually beyond retention, there are gender dynamics that are influencing individuals' health outcomes. Those are the two that immediately come to mind, David, but I would be very surprised if BC or Nicole didn't have things to add.
Are you waiting for me, Nicole, to like yell and scream and whatever, like this piece? Yeah, David, I mean, people that are here at this session are scientists and in healthcare and researchers, what have you. But I think too, we have to think about and Nicole sort of mentioned it, like our own wellness, but people who are coming and saying, well, it's not important, and how do we convince them? I think, if we look at change methods and how people do change and how culture change and how social change occurs in any community, and I think it exists in research as well, is that there are sort of different levels of anticipated change, and people get to those places and spaces in different ways. And so how are we influencing those changes? Is it just merely here's knowledge? Maybe they see a research participation invitation in an office or in their university or in their area of work, and they see that the language is different than what they're used to. So like so they're just opening up their expectations or opening up their understanding or of it, and then seeking more information and then actually integrating it into their practice. And then really, so there's sort of like, how do we do that? And we know the need to protect will always override the need to connect. So again, rather than sitting there sort of shoving it down people's faces and saying all these different things, it's how do we get people to be open and receptive to this way of being in research? And again, I'm sure Nicole has some stuff around that as well. So thinking of those change theories, and how we're talking to folks and how we're being, promoting that openness and that receptivity to learning and to just being exposed to a different way of doing things. We have these historical frameworks in healthcare and in research that continue to be racist, that continue to be oppressive, that continue to harm and often center bias and one's bias and stigma. My hope is before I get too gray or too white, that we'll see some changes in those practices. And so that's just sort of my feeling. But the more folks that we get involved in community, and the more that we can have community members themselves prioritizing this research and being a part of this research, not as participants, but as partners in research, I think that is probably one of the biggest ways that we can influence others in looking at how to do this in a different way.
Thanks, BC. Yeah, I kind of, I think just to kind of add to my colleagues' comments, I think from the knowledge translation space, we always talk about real world impact. And we know that despite the intervention type, there can be a gap in use. And when you look at, a framework like the learning health system that's being discussed a lot in Canada, they've now acknowledged that there's equity considerations that can limit the impact of a learning health system where you take innovation and you endeavor to deliver it to people. I think where the piece that Tamil brought up around gender is how might we reach more people with the interventions that are being created and understand the barriers to accessing some of these incredible innovations that are happening. And that kind of speaks to implementation science and social sciences and why we need to understand how people engage with, a clinical trial environment replicates kind of a clinical space. So there's so much to learn from that. Which seems like such a missed opportunity not to do it in that setting when you've asked someone to show up. I think the piece around, industry-sponsored trials, it's interesting. I just had a conversation with someone from our PHSA clinical trials team, and he mentioned to us that conflated language around sex and gender, and also gender such as pregnant women, menopausal women, can actually result in a significant number of protocol deviations, because sometimes people are, you'll request that people get screened for pregnancy before they start a medication when, no one's bothered to actually have proper inclusion and exclusion criteria that could have prevented that. And so I do think that, David, your role as someone who's kind of advocating for this is something that other researchers are also feeling, and they get pushback because there's template language as well. And I think what we also heard in that setting is that there's multiple sites, and if I change one thing for your site, I have to change it for all of these other sites. So I don't know that that's a proper answer or solution, but just things that come top of mind from that question.
Yeah, for sure. Like I would say from my experience, like a bit from the industry lens, like I've definitely had my own gender diverse patients. This is even a couple months ago, recruiting to an industry trial where there's not even a proper data collection to make sure that they're represented, right? And like I think when I think there's a gap in the industry and potentially regulatory space right now that needs to catch up to where everyone else is. And it's really our community and community academics across institutions and patient partners and community like partners to really push why this is important. And I think I agree with everything that's been said so far about, science, validity, generalizability, representative. But I think that moral argument is so important. Trust relationships. These are family members, friends, like colleagues. We live in Canada. It's a privilege to live here, work here, function in a healthcare system and a society that is, and I think that evolving piece is really important to identify too, that we're on a journey together. I think there's a question, I'll just read it out from Sasan Azad. So thank you for sharing this amazing work. As indicated, as a clinical researcher, we always follow the national published standards and guidelines. We want to be 110% equitable and do not exclude. How we could advocate for more centralized training and education of the workforce across the clinical trials ecosystem to make sure that we're all on the same page, following the same standardized operating procedures, policies, protocols, i.e. applicable to industry, investigators, sites, healthcare providers. There's that regulatory piece, participants, etc. As an observation, there is inconsistency in the practice. Appreciate your thoughts. Tough question. What do people think?
Well, the first thing that I'll say is that this is part of the work that we're moving towards, working with reviewers and research ethics boards to help them guide without representing undue barriers, but the real importance of like getting specific about gender and appropriately describing the research population, the study population. This is so critical. And so there are some examples in the guide, but this is a conversation that I think that we're going to be having and that we're inviting others to the conversation. But I also want to go to what BC said and what Nicole said in her presentation, that one of the things that causes a lot of discomfort in this space is that this is not a checklist exercise, really. So there can be education and greater awareness, and I would say we are moving in standardized sociodemographic questionnaires, both at provincial levels in some settings and at federal levels in Canada, towards identification of gender diversity. So this is, this is exciting at this standardized national level, but it's also really important to have that community engagement in the selection of the research questions and the development of the research instruments. So that is something else that we are strongly advocating for. And at the same time that we recognize that this can be uncomfortable, it can be uncomfortable because we are learning and we may be having our own biases and beliefs challenged as we go on this journey, right? So there's a place about being vulnerable as researchers. So I'm saying that from the researcher perspective.
Yeah, and I'm conscious of the time. I'll try to make it quick, Sasan. But I really appreciate your question. I think something that we're doing is trying to meet people where they're at. To Tamil's point, we'd love to continue speaking to the kind of clinical trials ecosystem communities, just like we're doing implementation with REBs. So if these are things that we apply for grants to do so that we can build KT products that are like meant for those certain spaces. So, platforms like CanTrain, because I think it's a two-pronged thing. It's a guide, and how do we also change culture and research culture by more connection and more of these conversations, which is why we're so grateful to have been here today.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I think it's very an optimistic and exciting and hopeful area that we're in and moving forward to. So I would like to thank again Tamil, Nicole, and BC for coming today and sharing their expertise and the wonderful work that they've been leading, and as well for everyone else for joining today. For everyone that registered today, you will get an email about a link to the video that you can review or share, and you'll also be able to find it there under the events section under the WCHRI website. All our speakers today also put their emails in the chat, so if there was something that you didn't have the chance to ask today, feel free to reach out to them and connect, and we'll continue this conversation. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.